Some folks know the kind of loneliness that sits heavy on your chest, making even the sunrise feel cold. That's how Elias Boone lived every day, a giant of a man on the plains of Red Bluff, eating cold beans in a cabin that echoed with silence. He was strong enough to break any wild horse, but gentle enough that children hid behind their mothers when he walked through town. After years of empty nights, he finally rode into Red Bluff and posted a simple note. "Need a cook." Clara May Sutton needed that job more than pride. A young widow with nothing but grief and a few old dresses, she'd heard the whispers about being plain and past her prime. But when she knocked on Elias's door, something shifted in both their hearts. What happens when two broken souls discover that love doesn't always come with fancy words? Sometimes it comes with fresh biscuits and a smile that lights up the darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The handwritten job notice had been pinned to the post office board for 3 days before Clara May Sutton finally worked up the courage to tear it down. Her fingers trembled as she read the careful block letters again. Need a cook. Good pay. No trouble. Ask for Elias Boone. Everyone in Red Bluff knew Elias Boone, though few had ever spoken more than a handful of words to him. At 6'7" and built like an oak tree, he cast a shadow that made grown men step aside. But Clara had watched him from her boarding house window, seen how he gentled wild horses with nothing but patience and soft words. She'd noticed how he tipped his hat to the preacher's wife, even when she crossed the street to avoid him. The morning sun painted the dusty main street in shades of gold as Clara made her way to the edge of town, where Elias's ranch sprawled across the valley. Her worn boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and she clutched her carpet bag containing her few possessions and her mother's old cookbook. The weight of desperation pressed against her chest had exactly $4.37 to her name, and Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that another week's rent was due, or she'd be sleeping under the stars. Elias's cabin stood at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of a working ranch. But even from a distance, Clara could see the loneliness that permeated the place. No flowers by the door, no curtains in the windows, no signs of a woman's touch anywhere. The porch sagged slightly, as if it too carried the weight of solitude. She paused at the gate, smoothing her faded blue dress and checking that her hair was properly pinned beneath her simple bonnet. The morning breeze carried the scent of hay and horses, mixed with something else, the absence of life that comes when a place lacks laughter and conversation. Inside the cabin, Elias was going through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed the same tasks alone for too many years. He filled his tin cup with coffee so black it could strip paint, ate yesterday's cold biscuits without tasting them, and stared out the window at another day stretching endlessly before him. The cabin told the story of his isolation in every corner. A single plate and cup sat by the sink, one chair at the kitchen table, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall with military precision. The only decoration was a faded photograph of his parents on the mantelpiece, their faces serious and formal in the way of old portraits. Elias had built this cabin with his own hands 15 years ago, dreaming of filling it with the sounds of family. He'd imagined children running through the rooms, a wife humming while she worked in the kitchen, the kinds of ordinary moments that made a house into a home. Instead, the rooms echoed with nothing but the tick of the mantel clock and his own footsteps. The knock at his door startled him from his reverie. Visitors were raremost folks in town, crossed the street rather than acknowledge his presence. He set down his coffee cup and walked to the door, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. When he opened the door, Clara May Sutton stood on his porch like a sparrow that had landed by mistake. She was small and slight, with dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples despite her young age. Her dress was clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches. But it was her eyes that caught him, brown and soft, with a depth that spoke of sorrow, understood and survived. "Mr. Boone!" Her voice was steady despite the way her hands gripped her carpet bag. I've come about the cooking position." Elias studied her for a long moment, taking in the determined set of her shoulders and the way she met his gaze without flinching. Most people found it difficult to look directly at him. His size made them uncomfortable, and the rumors about his past made them wary. But Clara May Sutton looked at him as if she saw a man, not a monster. "You're the widow Sutton," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I am." She lifted her chin slightly. "And you need a cook." He stepped aside to let her enter, and she walked into his sparse kitchen with the careful steps of someone assessing a new situation. Her gaze took in the bare walls, the single chair, the tin cup sitting lonely on the counter. When she turned back to him, there was something like understanding in her expression. "When did you last have a proper meal, Mr. Boone?" The question caught him off guard. He couldn't remember the last time someone had shown concern for his well-being. "I manage," he said. "That's not what I asked." Clara set her carpetbag on the floor and walked to his pantry, opening the door to reveal shelves lined with canned goods and little else. "When did you last have fresh bread? A hot meal that wasn't beans from a can?" Elias found himself without an answer. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of food as nourishment and started seeing it as merely fuel. The act of eating had become as mechanical as every other part of his existence. Clara's story was written in the careful way she moved through his kitchen, testing the temperature of the stove, checking the quality of his pots and pans. She'd been married to Thomas Sutton for 6 years before consumption took him last spring. They'd been planning to start a family, had saved every penny for a little house on the good side of town. Instead, she'd spent their savings on medicine that couldn't save him, and funeral expenses that left her with nothing but memories and a widow's pension that wouldn't keep a cat alive. The townspeople had been kind at first, bringing casseroles and offering condolences, but kindness has a way of wearing thin when grief lingers too long. The whispers started after a few months. She was too young to carry on like that, they said. Plain little thing, but she could find another husband if she tried. When she couldn't afford to keep the house, they clucked their tongues and suggested she might find work as a seamstress or a cleaning woman. But Clara had pride, and she had skills. She'd been cooking since she was tall enough to reach the stove, helping her mother feed a family of 7 on a farmer's wages. She knew how to make a dollar stretch, how to turn simple ingredients into meals that satisfied both body and soul. "The job pays $15 a month," Elias said, watching her examine his meager supplies, "plus room and board if you want it." $15 was more than generous, more than she could make, taking in laundry or mending clothes. "And what exactly would my duties be?" "Cook, clean some, I suppose, keep the place from falling down around my ears." He paused, struggling with words that felt rusty from disuse. "I'm not looking for anything improper, Mrs. Sutton, just tired of eating my own cooking." Clara nodded, understanding more than he'd said aloud. This was a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be cared for, who'd grown so used to solitude that he'd stopped believing he deserved anything better. "I'll need Sundays off for church," she said. "Done. And I'll want to make changes to the kitchen. Better supplies, proper seasonings. Whatever you need." She walked to the window and looked out at the rolling hills beyond the ranch. The view was beautiful, in a stark, honest way, no pretense, no false promises, just land that would give back what you put into it. It felt like a place where a person could start over, where the past might finally stop defining the future. "I'll take the position, Mr. Boone." The relief in his eyes was so profound that Clara had to look away. When was the last time this man had heard good news? When had anyone chosen to stay rather than leave? "When can you start?" he asked. "Today, if you'd like. I'll need to collect my things from the boarding house." "I'll drive you." The offer surprised them both. Elias wasn't in the habit of making social gestures, and Clara wasn't used to such consideration. As they rode into town in his wagon, Clara found herself stealing glances at the giant beside her. His hands were gentle on the reins despite their size, and he spoke softly to his horses. She'd heard the stories how he'd appeared in Red Bluff 15 years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and enough money to buy a small spread. How he'd built his ranch from nothing, through sheer determination and backbreaking work. How he kept to himself and never caused trouble, but somehow still managed to frighten people. But sitting beside him now, Clara didn't feel afraid. She felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. This man needed taking care of, whether he knew it or not. And she needed to be needed. The boarding house buzzed with whispered conversations when they arrived. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows nearly disappeared into her hairline when she saw Clara climbing down from Elias Boone's wagon. "Clara May, what are you thinking?" the older woman hissed as Clara packed her few belongings. "That man's got a reputation." "For what?" "Working hard and minding his own business." "For being strange, unnatural, a man that size, living all alone out there. It's not right." Clara folded her late husband's photograph carefully between layers of clothing. What's not right is judging a man by his size instead of his character. But even as she defended him, Clara wondered if she was making a mistake. She was about to move to an isolated ranch with a man she barely knew, based on nothing more than intuition and desperation. Still, when she climbed back into the wagon and saw the hope in Elias's eyes, she knew she'd made the right choice. As they drove back toward the ranch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley, neither of them spoke much. But there was a comfortable quality to the silence, as if they both understood they were embarking on something that might change everything. The handwritten job notice lay crumpled in Clara's carpet bag, its purpose served. Neither of them could have imagined that those simple words would be the first step toward healing wounds they'd both thought permanent, toward finding love in the most unexpected place of all. Clara's first morning in Elias's kitchen began before sunrise, the way all proper cooking days should. She'd spent the night in the small room off the kitchen that he'd hastily prepared for her, just a narrow bed and a washstand, but clean and private. The wedding ring she still wore on a chain around her neck caught the lamplight as she dressed, a constant reminder of the life she'd lost and the guilt she carried for daring to feel alive again. The kitchen felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, less stark, more hopeful somehow. Clara lit the stove and began her work with the reverence of someone who understood that feeding people was about more than just satisfying hunger. It was about creating warmth, comfort, connectional, the things this house had been missing. She'd found eggs in the henhouse and fresh milk in the cool cellar. The pantry, while sparse, contained quality staples that spoke of a man who valued good food, even if he'd forgotten how to enjoy it. By the time the sun painted the eastern horizon pink, the cabin filled with aromas that hadn't graced these walls in years: coffee that wasn't burnt, bacon sizzling in the pan, biscuits rising golden in the oven. Elias woke to something he'd only experienced in dreams, the smell of breakfast cooking and the soft sounds of someone else moving through his house. For a moment, lying in his narrow bed, he allowed himself to imagine this was how normal people lived. That he wasn't the lonely giant on the edge of town, but simply a man whose wife was preparing their morning meal. The fantasy dissolved when he remembered the truth. Clara May Sutton was his employee, nothing more. She was here because she needed work and he needed cooking. The loneliness that had driven him to post that notice was his burden to bear, not hers to cure. He dressed quickly and walked to the kitchen, stopping in the doorway to watch Clara work. She moved with quiet efficiency, her small hands sure and steady as she turned the bacon, checked the biscuits, poured coffee into 2 cups. 2 cups. When was the last time he'd seen 2 cups on his kitchen counter? "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind I took the liberty of gathering eggs from your hens. They're good layers." "That's what they're for," he said, his voice rougher than usual. The sight of her in his kitchen, the domestic normalcy of it all, affected him more than he cared to admit. She turned then, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not pity, he'd seen enough of that to recognize it, but something softer. Understanding, perhaps. As if she knew what it meant to wake up alone day after day, to go through the motions of living without really being alive. "Breakfast is ready," she said simply. They sat at his small table, Clara having somehow produced a second chair from somewhere in the house. The meal was perfect fluffy biscuits with butter and honey, eggs cooked just right, bacon crisp but not burnt. But it wasn't the food that undid him. It was the way Clara filled her own plate without hesitation, settling into the chair across from him, as if she belonged there. "This is good," he said, the words inadequate for what he was feeling. "My mother always said the secret to good biscuits is not overworking the dough," Clara replied, cutting her eggs with delicate precision. "Let it come together gentle-like, and it'll treat you right." They ate in comfortable silence, punctuated only by the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Elias found himself studying Clara when she wasn't looking the way. Morning light caught the silver threads in her hair, the careful way she buttered her biscuit, the wedding ring glinting at her throat. "How long were you married?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Clara's hand went instinctively to the chain around her neck. 6 years. Thomas was a good man, gentle and kind, like you. The comparison startled him. "I'm not. People don't usually call me gentle." "Then they haven't been paying attention." Clara met his eyes across the table. "I watched you with that horse yesterday, the chestnut mare. You could have forced her into that stall, but you waited. Let her come to you in her own time." Elias stared at his plate, unused to being seen so clearly. "Horses are easier than people." "Are they? I wonder." Clara rose to clear the dishes, her movements graceful despite her small stature. "Sometimes I think people and horses aren't so different. Both need to trust before they can be truly settled." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Clara busied herself at the sink, washing dishes with careful attention, while Elias finished his coffee and tried to process the shift that had occurred in his carefully ordered world. "I'll be working the north pasture today," he said finally, standing to leave. "Don't expect me for lunch. I'll pack something for you to take along." The offer was practical, businesslike, but there was warmth beneath it that made his heart stutter. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. "Mr. Boone, thank you. For the job, for giving me a chance. I know what people in town say about me, that I'm plain, that I should have found another husband by now. But you looked past all that." Elias turned back to find her watching him with those deep brown eyes. "Mrs. Sutton, I don't know what fool told you that you were plain, but they need their eyes checked." The words were out before he could stop them, and the blush that colored Clara's cheeks made him realize he'd crossed some invisible line. She was his employee, a respectable widow who deserved his protection, not his awkward compliments. "I should get to work," he said gruffly, grabbing his hat from the peg by the door. But as he walked toward the barn, Elias could swear he heard something he hadn't heard in his house for 15 years, the soft sound of a woman humming while she worked. The day passed differently than usual. Instead of the grinding solitude that typically accompanied his chores, Elias found himself anticipating his return to the house. He caught himself looking toward the cabin windows, seeing smoke from the chimney and lamplight glowing warm against the approaching evening. When he finally made his way back for supper, the transformation was even more apparent. Clara had found tablecloth somewhere, probably, made it herself from fabric in her carpet bagand. The table was set with care. Wildflowers from the meadow behind the house sat in a mason jar, bringing color and life to the stark room. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "A meal should be a celebration," Clara replied, ladling stew into bowls, even a simple one. They talked more easily over supper, sharing stories of their past lives with the careful politeness of people testing new waters. Clara spoke of her childhood on a farm, of learning to make do with little and find joy in simple things. Elias found himself telling her about his early days in Red Bluff, the challenges of building a ranch from nothing, the satisfaction of honest work under an endless sky. But it was when Clara laughed, really laughed at, something he said about a particularly stubborn bull, that Elias felt the earth shift beneath his feet. The sound was like music after years of silence, and he realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that he was in danger of wanting things he had no right to want. After supper, Clara insisted on cleaning up while Elias sat by the fire with his coffee. The domestic scene felt simultaneously natural and impossible, as if he were living in someone else's life, borrowing happiness that didn't truly belong to him. "Mrs. Sutton," he said as she hung up the dish towel, "I want you to know what we have here. It's just business. I wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable or think I expected anything more." Clara turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Of course, Mr. Boone, I understand completely." But as she bid him good night and disappeared into her small room, Elias wondered if either of them understood anything at all. Because sitting there in his suddenly warm kitchen, surrounded by the lingering evidence of Clara's presence, he knew that everything had changed. The wedding ring around Clara's neck felt heavier as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to Elias moving around in the main room. She'd felt something shift today, something dangerous and wonderful and completely inappropriate. She was Thomas's widow, still in mourning, still wearing his ring. She had no business feeling her heart quicken when Elias called her pretty, no right to the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled. But in the darkness of her small room, surrounded by the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was finally beginning to feel like a home, Clara allowed herself to wonder what might happen if two broken people dared to trust again. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Clara discovered Elias's father's saddle hidden beneath a dusty tarp in the far corner of the barn. She'd been looking for extra grain sacks when her foot caught the leather edge, pulling away the covering to reveal a masterpiece of craftsmanship, hand-tooled leather dark with age, silver conchos that had lost their shine, and a horn worn smooth by countless hands. "That belonged to my father." Elias's voice came from behind her, startling her from her examination. Clara straightened, her hand still resting on the saddle's pommel. "It's beautiful work. Why is it hidden away out here?" Something shifted in Elias's expression, a shadow passing over his features like clouds across the sun. Some things are better left alone. But Clara had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, the way his shoulders tensed when memories pressed too close, the careful distance he maintained when emotions threatened to surface. She'd seen this same guardedness in her own mirror during the months after Thomas died, when well-meaning neighbors asked too many questions about feelings too raw to examine. "He must have been a fine horseman," she said gently, running her fingers along the leather's tooled pattern. "He was." Elias moved closer, his large frame casting shadows in the barn's dusty light. "Best rider in 3 counties, people said. Could gentle any horse, no matter how wild or broken." The past tense hung heavy between them, loaded with unspoken history. Clara waited, understanding that some stories could only be told in their own time, in their own way. "I was 12 when he left," Elias continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Came out here one morning to do chores, and his horse was gone. His clothes, his gear, everything except this saddle. Found it sitting on my bed with a note that said I'd grow into it someday." Clara's heart ached for the boy he'd been, waiting for a father who would never return. "And did you grow into it?" Elias shook his head. "Never could bring myself to use it. Felt like admitting he wasn't coming back." The vulnerability in his admission broke something open in Clara's chest. Here was the source of his careful distance, his reluctance to trust in permanence. He'd learned early that people left, that love was a luxury that could be withdrawn without warning. "Maybe," she said carefully, "he left it because he knew you'd become the kind of man who wouldn't need to prove anything to anyone, the kind who could be gentle without being weak." Elias looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Find something good in every broken thing." Clara smiled, her fingers still tracing the saddle's worn leather. "Practice, I suppose. Had plenty of broken things to work with." Their days had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and charged with unspoken possibility. Clara rose before dawn to start breakfast, humming softly as she worked. Elias would appear in the kitchen precisely at sunrise, his hair still damp from washing, his eyes seeking hers across the morning light. They'd eat together, sharing small talk about the weather, the livestock, the never-ending work of ranch life. But beneath the ordinary conversation lay currents of deeper connection. The way Elias always poured her coffee first, remembering exactly how she liked it. The way Clara saved him the best biscuit, the one with the perfect golden crust. Small gestures that spoke of care, of attention, of the kind of tenderness that grew in quiet moments between two people learning to trust. The town noticed, of course. Red Bluff was too small for secrets, and the sight of Clara May Sutton driving Elias Boone's wagon into town for supplies set tongues wagging faster than Sunday morning church bells. "It's not natural," Mrs. Henderson declared to anyone who would listen. "A decent woman living alone with that giant. Mark my words, no good will come of it." But Clara had stopped caring about the whispers. For the first time since Thomas died, she woke each morning with purpose, with something to look forward to. The simple pleasure of cooking for someone who appreciated her efforts, of seeing Elias's face light up when she tried a new recipe, filled spaces in her heart she'd thought permanently empty. The changes in Elias were more subtle but no less profound. He'd always been a man of few words, but Clara began to notice the way he lingered over breakfast, reluctant to start his day and break the spell of their shared mornings. He'd taken to bringing her small gifts, wildflowers picked during his rides, a pretty stone from the creek, a bird's nest blown down in the last storm. Nothing of monetary value, but treasures nonetheless, proof that he thought of her even when they were apart. One evening, as Clara prepared supper, she found herself humming an old song her mother used to sing while cooking. The melody drifted through the kitchen, mixing with the scents of roasting chicken and fresh bread. She didn't realize Elias had returned from his work until she turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Don't stop," he said when she fell silent. "It's been 15 years since this house heard music." "I didn't realize I was singing," Clara said, her cheeks warming under his steady gaze. "My mother used to hum while she cooked," Elias said, moving into the kitchen but maintaining his careful distance. "Before she got sick, before everything changed, I'd forgotten how much I missed it." There was such longing in his voice that Clara felt her resolve wavering. She'd promised herself she would maintain proper boundaries, remember her place as his employee. But the man standing before her looked so alone, so hungry for the simple comfort of human connection, that her heart overruled her head. "Would you like me to teach you the words?" she asked. "It's an old hymn, in the sweet by and by. My mother said it was about hope, about believing in better days ahead." Elias nodded, and Clara began to sing softly, her voice clear and sweet in the gathering twilight. He listened intently, as if memorizing every note, every word. When she finished, the silence that followed felt different than their usual comfortable, quiet charged with possibility and the kind of tender understanding that grows between two people who recognize their own loneliness reflected in another's eyes. "Clara," he said, her name falling from his lips for the first time without the formal Mrs. Sutton. The sound of it, spoken in his deep, gentle voice, sent warmth cascading through her entire body. "Yes? Thank you. For everything, for making this place feel like a home again." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that went far beyond gratitude for cooking and cleaning. Clara felt the chain around her neck, the wedding ring that had anchored her to the past, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she wondered if love might be possible twice in one lifetime. "Elias," she said, his name feeling both foreign and perfectly right on her tongue, "you don't have to thank me for finding my way home too." That night, after Clara had retired to her small room, Elias sat by the dying fire and thought about the changes that had transformed his life in just 3 weeks. The house felt alive now, filled with Clara's presence, even when she wasn't in the room. Her touch was everywhere, in the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, in the garden she'd started behind the kitchen, in the way his tin coffee cup had been replaced by proper china that she'd somehow procured on one of their trips to town. But more than the physical changes, Clara had awakened something in him that he'd thought dead and buried with his childhood dreams. Hope, perhaps. Or simply the radical possibility that he might deserve the kind of happiness he'd watched other men take for granted. In her small room, Clara lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the creaking of the house, settling into sleep. Her hand found the chain around her neck, fingering the wedding ring that had been her constant companion through months of grief and loss. Thomas would want her to be happy, she knew that. He'd been the kind of man who believed in love's power to heal, to transform, to make broken things whole again. But knowing and feeling were different things entirely, and the guilt of caring for another man still sat heavy in her chest. Still, as sleep finally claimed her, Clara found herself dreaming not of the past, but of the future of mornings filled with laughter instead of tears, of a house that rang with joy instead of echoing with loneliness, of a love that might be different from what she'd known before, but no less real, no less precious for being found in the most unexpected place of all. Clara's recipe book lay open on the kitchen table, its pages yellowed with age and splattered with the evidence of countless meals prepared with love. She'd brought it from her old life, along with her few dresses and her mother's silver thimble, thinking it might help her remember who she used to be. Instead, as she turned through the familiar pages, she found herself imagining new dishes, new combinations of flavors that might bring a smile to Elias's weathered face. The book held more than recipes. It contained the history of her marriage to Thomas, written in pencil notes and food stains. Thomas's favorite, she'd scrawled beside the apple pie recipe. Too sweet for Tom, next to the honey cake. Made this for our first anniversary, marking the elaborate roast chicken that had taken her all day to prepare. Each notation was a small memorial to a love that had been cut short, but as Clara sat in Elias's kitchen planning the day's meals, she realized the sharp edge of grief had begun to soften. The memories no longer felt like wounds that might never heal thee, felt like gifts, proof that she'd been capable of deep love once and might be capable of it again. "What's that you're reading?" Elias asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his usual morning quietness. "Old recipes," Clara said, closing the book with gentle reverence. "My mother started this collection, and I added to it over the years." Elias poured himself coffee from the pot Clara had prepared, his movements careful and deliberate. In the 6 weeks since she'd arrived, they'd developed an easy choreography around each other. He knew to leave space for her at the stove. She knew to have his coffee ready exactly when he appeared for breakfast. "Must be nice," he said, settling into his chair, "having family recipes to pass down." There was wistfulness in his voice that made Clara look up from her planning. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of his loneliness, the way his shoulders curved, slightly inward when he spoke of family, the careful distance he maintained from anything that hinted at permanence or tradition. "Did your mother cook?" Clara asked, beginning to prepare their breakfast with practiced efficiency. "Some. She tried, anyway." Elias wrapped his large hands around his coffee cup, as if drawing warmth from it. "We moved around a lot when I was young. Never stayed anywhere long enough to develop traditions." Clara cracked eggs into the skillet, the familiar sizzle filling the comfortable silence. She'd begun to piece together fragments of Elias's past, from these small revelations of childhood marked by instability, parents who'd never quite settled anywhere long enough to call it home. "What about your father's people? Didn't they have traditions?" Elias's expression darkened slightly. "My father didn't talk much about where he came from, said the past was something to leave behind, not carry forward." The sadness in his voice made Clara's chest tighten. Here was a man who'd grown up without roots, without the small ceremonies and customs that made a family feel permanent. No wonder he seemed to hold himself apart from the possibility of connection. He'd never learned to trust in anything lasting. "Well," Clara said, sliding eggs onto his plate with deliberate cheerfulness, "maybe it's time to start some new traditions." The hope that flickered in Elias's eyes was so brief she might have imagined it, but Clara stored it away like a treasure. She was learning that healing happened in small moments, in the accumulation of ordinary kindnesses that slowly rebuilt a person's faith in goodness. Their breakfast conversation meandered through safer topics: the weather, the cattle prices, the need to repair the fence in the south pasture. But underneath the practical discussion lay currents of deeper connection, the kind of intimate understanding that develops between two people who've seen each other's vulnerabilities and chosen gentleness instead of judgment. After Elias left for his morning chores, Clara found herself drawn back to the recipe book. She turned to a blank page near the back and picked up her pencil, hesitating only a moment before writing. Elias's favorite biscuits, extra butter, touch of honey. It was a small thing, but it felt like a declaration of intent, a statement that this new life she was building deserved its own documentation. The morning flew by as Clara threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She baked bread that would stay soft for days, prepared a stew that would improve with time, and mixed up cookie dough that she could shape and bake fresh each evening. Each task felt like an investment in their shared future, a way of saying that she intended to stay, to make this place as much of a home for herself as it was becoming for him. She was just pulling the bread from the oven when she heard voices outside. Elias's deep rumble mixed with higher, sharper tones that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Through the kitchen window, she could see 3 women from town standing near the gate, their posture radiating disapproval and barely contained gossip. Mrs. Henderson led the delegation, her grey hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. Beside her stood Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Cole, whose husband owned the general store. All 3 were pillars of Red Bluff society, the kind of women who measured virtue by adherence to unspoken rules and found scandal in any deviation from their narrow expectations. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, her chin lifted in defiance of the butterflies dancing in her stomach. "Ladies," she said with careful politeness, "what brings you out to the ranch today?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over Clara's flour-dusted dress, her wind-tousled hair, her obvious comfort in this place that had become home. "Clara May, we've come as friends out of concern for your reputation." "My reputation is just fine, thank you." "Is it?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Because the whole town is talking about your living arrangements. A respectable widow, alone with a man like Elias Boonwell. It just doesn't look right." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Boone is a gentleman and my employer. There's nothing improper about honest work." "Honest work," Mrs. Cole repeated with a sniff. "That's what you call living in sin with a man who's never darkened a church door." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because she could see how others might interpret her situation. In the eyes of these women, any unmarried man and woman sharing the same roof were automatically suspect, regardless of the actual nature of their relationship. "I have my own room," Clara said, hating that she felt compelled to defend herself. "I prepare Mr. Boone's meals and maintain his household. Nothing more." "Yet," Mrs. Henderson said with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all, "but Clara May, surely you can see how this looks. A young widow, living alone with a man of Elias Boone's reputation." "What reputation?" Clara's voice sharpened. "That he works hard, that he minds his own business, that he's never caused trouble for anyone in this town?" "That he's strange," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "Unnatural. A man that size, with that temper." "What temper?" Clara stepped forward, her protective instincts flaring. "I've lived in this house for 6 weeks, and I've never seen Mr. Boone raise his voice or lose his composure." "You don't know him like we do," Mrs. Cole insisted. "He's been trouble since the day he arrived in Red Bluff. There are stories." "There are always stories about people who don't fit into neat little boxes," Clara interrupted. "But I judge a man by his actions, not by gossip and speculation." The 3 women exchanged meaningful glances, the kind of silent communication that spoke of predetermined conclusions and fixed opinions. "Clara May," Mrs. Henderson said with exaggerated patience, "we're only thinking of your welfare. Come back to town, find respectable work. Mrs. Patterson knows a family in Denver who needs a governess. I have respectable work here." "This isn't respectable." Mrs. Cole's voice rose, her composure finally cracking. "Living in sin with a man who's probably too rough to know the difference between a lady and a—" The words hung unfinished in the air, but their implication was clear enough to make Clara's face burn with humiliation and anger. "I think you ladies should leave," Clara said, her voice deadly quiet. "We're only trying to help," Mrs. Henderson protested, but she was already backing toward the gate. "Then help by keeping your opinions to yourselves." As the three women climbed into their buggy, Clara heard Mrs. Cole's stage whisper, "Mark my words, she'll regret defending him when his true nature shows itself." Clara stood on the porch long after the buggy disappeared down the road, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. She'd known the gossip would come eventually, small towns fed on speculation like vultures on carrion, but hearing her relationship with Elias reduced to something sordid and shameful made her feel sick. When Elias appeared around the corner of the barn, his face dark with suppressed emotion, Clara realized he'd heard at least part of the conversation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. "I should have known this would happen, should have thought about what people would say." "Don't you dare apologize for their small minds," Clara said fiercely, "and don't you dare suggest that I should care more about their opinions than I do about doing what's right for me." Elias looked at her with something like wonder. "You defended me." "Of course I defended you. You're a good man, Elias Boone, no matter what those busybodies think. But your reputation—" "My reputation will survive some gossip. What it wouldn't survive is running away from the best thing that's happened to me in months, just because some people can't see past their own prejudices." The words were out before Clara could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. She'd revealed more than she'd intended, let slip the truth that her feelings for Elias had grown far beyond simple employment. "Clara," Elias said, her name a prayer on his lips. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if remembering all the reasons why hope was dangerous for people like them. "I should get back to lunch," Clara said, suddenly flustered by the intensity of his gaze. But as she turned toward the house, she felt his hand catch her arm gently. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying, for standing up for me, for seeing something in me that I'm not sure is really there." Clara looked up into his face, seeing past the size and strength that frightened others to the tender heart that beat beneath. "It's there, Elias. Maybe you just needed someone to point it out." That evening, as they sat down to supper, Clara noticed that Elias had changed his shirt and combed his hair with extra care. The gesture was small but significant, a sign that he was beginning to see himself as worthy of such attentions. "Those women today," he said as Clara served the stew, "they weren't entirely wrong, about appearances, I mean." Clara set down the ladle with deliberate calm. "Are you suggesting I should leave?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "No, I don't want you to suffer for my sake." "Elias," Clara said, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "the only suffering I've done since coming here is the suffering of watching you believe you don't deserve happiness." His fingers curled around hers, large and warm and careful. "I'm not sure I know how to be happy anymore." "Then we'll learn together," Clara said, squeezing his hand gently, "one meal at a time." As they ate in comfortable silence, Clara felt something shift between them, a deepening of connection that went beyond friendship or even attraction. They were two wounded souls who'd found healing in each other's presence, and no amount of gossip or social pressure could diminish the profound rightness of what they were building together. Later, as Clara prepared for bed, she opened her recipe book to the page where she'd written about Elias's favorite biscuits. Below that entry, she added another: "Beef stew for courage made, the day I chose love over reputation." It was another small tradition, another way of documenting this new life she was creating with deliberate intention and growing hope. The broken fence post stood like a monument to neglect in the south pasture, its splintered wood testament to the relentless pressure of cattle and weather. Clara discovered it during one of her afternoon walks, when the confines of the house had grown too small for the restless energy that seemed to build in her chest whenever she thought about the changes happening in her heart. She'd taken to exploring the ranch in the late afternoons, partly to familiarize herself with the land that was becoming home, and partly to steal moments of solitude where she could examine her feelings without the weight of Elias's presence, making clear thinking impossible. The fence post, leaning at a precarious angle with wire sagging dangerously, seemed like a perfect metaphor for the boundaries in her own life structures that had once seemed permanent, now strained beyond their breaking point. "That's been needing repair for weeks." Elias's voice came from behind her, startling her from her contemplation. She turned to find him approaching on horseback, his familiar silhouette dark against the afternoon sky. Even after 2 months of living in the same house, the sight of him still had the power to make her breath catch. There was something about the way he sat, a horse completely at ease, as if he and the animal were parts of the same whole, that spoke to the gentle strength she'd come to love about him. Love. The word had been creeping into her thoughts more frequently, unbidden and unwelcome and utterly undeniable. She loved the way he carefully poured her coffee each morning, the way he listened to her stories with complete attention, the way he'd begun humming her mother's old hymns while he worked. She loved his careful hands and his thoughtful silences, and the rare, brilliant smile that transformed his entire face when she managed to surprise him with something unexpected. "I could help you fix it," she said, the offer surprising them both. Elias dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "It's hard work, Clara. Dirty work. I'm not afraid of either." She moved closer to examine the damage, acutely aware of his presence beside her. "Growing up on a farm, you learn that everyone pulls their weight. Fence mending was as much a part of my childhood as cooking and sewing." "I don't doubt your ability," Elias said carefully. "But what would people say if they saw you doing man's work?" The question hung between them, loaded with all the expectations and limitations that seemed to follow them everywhere. Clara thought of the 3 women who'd visited the ranch, of their whispered judgments and thinly veiled threats. The weight of social convention pressed against her shoulders like a yoke she'd never asked to wear. "Let them say whatever they want," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's rules." Something shifted in Elias's expression, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun and everything to do with the fierce independence he was witnessing. "All right then. We'll fix it together." They worked side by side as the sun tracked across the western sky, their movements developing an easy rhythm born of shared purpose. Clara held the new post steady while Elias drove it deep into the hard-packed earth, his powerful shoulders flexing beneath his work shirt. She stretched wire with competent hands while he secured it with practiced efficiency, their bodies moving in unconscious harmony around the familiar task. "You weren't lying about knowing fence work," Elias said as Clara twisted wire with the skill of someone who'd done it countless times before. "Thomas and I mended miles of fence together," she replied, then paused, realizing it was the first time she'd mentioned her late husband's name without the sharp stab of grief that usually accompanied such memories. "He used to say that good fences made for peaceful neighbors and peaceful minds." Sounds like he was a wise man. Clara looked up from her work to find Elias watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was, different from you, but wise in his own way. Different how? The question was asked with careful neutrality, but Clara heard the uncertainty beneath it, the fear of a man comparing himself to a ghost and finding himself lacking. "Thomas was quick to laugh, quick to speak, quick to act," she said thoughtfully. "He filled rooms with his presence, made friends everywhere he went. Your deeper waters, Elias, quieter but no less good." They finished the repair as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their hands brushing as they gathered tools in the growing twilight. Each accidental touch sent warmth shooting up Clara's arms, and she found herself lingering over tasks that should have taken minutes, reluctant to break the spell of working together toward a common goal. "Thank you," Elias said as they walked back toward the house, tools heavy in their hands. For the help, and for—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed too large for speech. "For seeing me as someone worth comparing favorably to a good man's memory." Clara stopped walking, the weight of his vulnerability making her chest tight with unnamed emotion. In the gathering darkness, with only starlight to illuminate his face, she could see past the careful walls he'd built around his heart to the lonely boy who'd been abandoned too young, who'd learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for acceptance. "Elias," she said softly, "you're not competing with Thomas's memory. You're creating something entirely new." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, the air crackling with possibility and the kind of tension that comes when two people realize they're standing at the edge of a precipice that will change everything once crossed. "Clara," Elias said, her name rough with longing. "Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the star-filled darkness between them, simple and devastating and completely true. Clara felt her heart stutter, then begin to race with a rhythm she'd thought she'd never feel again. "I think," she whispered, "I've already fallen." When Elias kissed her, it was with the reverent care of a man who'd never expected to hold something so precious. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, asking permission, even as they claimed what was freely offered. Clara's hands found the solid warmth of his chest, felt the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own. The kiss was everything their careful courtship had been building toward, tender and desperate, and full of the kind of hope that comes when two broken people realize they might be able to make each other whole. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against Elias's chest and tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She was in love again. Despite the guilt, despite the gossip, despite every rational reason why this was complicated and difficult and potentially disastrous, she was completely, irrevocably in love with Elias Boone. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Elias admitted, his arms tightening around her, as if she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. "I never expected this. Never thought I'd be lucky enough to have someone like you choose someone like me. There's no choice involved," Clara said, pulling back to look into his face. "Love isn't something you decide to do, Elias. It's something that happens whether you're ready for it or not." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, both lost in the wonder of this new territory they'd discovered. But as they reached the porch, reality began to intrude on their happiness. Clara thought of the wedding ring still hanging around her neck, of the gossip that was already swirling through town, of the complicated dance they'd have to navigate between their growing feelings and the expectations of the world around them. "The town," she began. "Let them talk," Elias said firmly. "I've spent 15 years caring too much what other people think. I won't let their opinions cost me the best thing that's ever happened to me." That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her lips still tingling from Elias's kiss, her heart full of emotions too complex to name. Love and guilt warred in her chest, love for the man sleeping in the next room who'd awakened parts of her she'd thought died with Thomas, and guilt for the speed with which her heart had moved from mourning to hope. She reached for the chain around her neck, fingering Thomas's wedding ring in the darkness. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his memory. "I never meant for this to happen so fast, but I can't be sorry that it happened at all." In the main room, Elias sat by the dying fire and marveled at the turn his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been resigned to a lifetime of solitude, convinced that a man like him didn't deserve the kind of happiness other people took for granted. Now he held the memory of Clara's kiss like a treasure, proof that love could find even the most unlikely candidates if they were brave enough to accept it. But beneath his joy lay the cold knowledge that their happiness wouldn't go unchallenged. The forces that had tried to drive Clara away once would surely try again, and next time they might bring more than just harsh words and social pressure. He'd seen the way Jeremiah Crane looked at Clara when she came to town, had heard whispers about the cattle baron's interest in acquiring land that might serve his expanding empire. Elias had something worth protecting now, something precious and fragile, and more valuable than all the gold in California. The question was whether he'd prove strong enough to keep it safe when the real challenges came. The photograph of Clara's late husband had sat on the kitchen mantelpiece since her first day at the ranch, a silver-framed reminder of the life she'd left behind. For 3 months, she'd glanced at Thomas's serious face each morning as she prepared breakfast, drawing comfort from his familiar features while guilt gnawed at her growing feelings for Elias. But this morning, the day after their first kiss, Clara found herself studying the photograph with different eyes. Thomas looked so young in the formal portrait, barely 25, with his hair slicked back and his Sunday suit pressed to perfection. They'd been happy together, she and Thomas comfortable and content in the quiet way of people who'd grown up expecting little more from life than honest work and simple pleasures. What she felt for Elias was entirely different, more intense, more complicated, charged with the desperate urgency of two people who'd learned that happiness was fragile and shouldn't be postponed for fear of social convention. Where her love for Thomas had been the gentle warmth of a hearth fire, her feelings for Elias burned like a forge, transforming everything they touched. Clara picked up the photograph, running her finger along the silver frame Thomas had saved for months to buy. "I need to let you go," she whispered to his image. "Not forget you, but stop using you as an excuse to be afraid of living." She carried the photograph to her small room, wrapping it carefully in tissue paper before placing it in the bottom drawer of her dresser. It felt like a sacred act, this moving of Thomas from the public space of the kitchen to the private sanctuary of her own room, acknowledging their shared past while making space for a different kind of future. When Elias appeared for breakfast, his hair still damp from washing, and his eyes seeking hers with new intimacy, Clara felt the rightness of her decision settle into her bones. This man deserved better than to compete with a ghost for space in her heart. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her stomach flutter. "Good morning." Clara poured his coffee, their fingers brushing as she handed him the cup. The simple touch sent warmth cascading through her entire body, and she marveled at how quickly her physical awareness of him had shifted from careful avoidance to eager anticipation. "Sleep well?" Elias asked, though the heat in his eyes suggested he'd spent his night thinking about their kiss with the same intense focus that had kept Clara staring at the ceiling until dawn. Eventually, Clara busied herself with breakfast preparation, acutely aware of Elias watching her every movement. "You?" "Eventually," he echoed, and something in his tone made her look up to find him smiling, really smiling, for what might have been the first time since she'd known him. The transformation was remarkable. Without the careful mask of reserve he usually wore, Elias looked younger, more open, almost boyish despite his massive frame. Clara felt her heart perform complicated gymnastics in her chest, and she had to grip the edge of the stove to steady herself against the intensity of her response to this new version of the man she loved. Loved. The word no longer felt foreign or guilt-inducing. She loved Elias Boone completely, without reservation, and the freedom of that admission was intoxicating. "Clara," Elias said, rising from his chair to move closer. "About last night." "Don't," she interrupted, turning to face him. "Don't apologize, or take it back, or tell me it was a mistake. I was going to say it was the best moment of my life." The simple honesty of his words broke something open in Clara's chest. She reached up to cup his face, marveling at the way his eyes closed when she touched him, as if her hands carried some kind of healing magic. "Mine too," she whispered. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with the confidence of two people who'd stopped pretending they didn't want exactly what was happening. Clara's arms wound around Elias's neck, pulling him down to her level, while his large hands spanned her waist with reverent care. They might have stayed there forever, lost in the wonder of finally being able to touch freely, if not for the sound of horses approaching the house. They broke apart with mutual reluctance, both breathing hard, Clara's hair mussed, and Elias's shirt wrinkled from her exploring hands. "Expecting someone?" Clara asked, smoothing her skirts and trying to compose herself. No. Elias moved to the window, his expression darkening as he recognized the riders. It's Jeremiah Crane and two of his men. Clara had heard of Crane but never met him, the cattle baron who owned half the county and was rumored to want the other half. According to town gossip, he'd arrived in Red Bluff 5 years ago with more money than anyone knew what to do with and a vision of turning the entire valley into his personal empire. What does he want here? Clara asked, instinctively moving closer to Elias. Nothing good. Elias straightened his shirt and reached for his hat. Stay inside, Clara. Let me handle this. But Clara was already untying her apron, her chin lifting with the stubborn determination Elias had come to know and love. If he's here about the ranch, I have every right to hear what he has to say. Clara, we're partners now, Elias. In whatever comes. The word partners hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. But Elias nodded, understanding that Clara May Sutton wasn't the kind of woman who hid in the kitchen when trouble came calling. They stepped onto the porch together as Crane and his men dismounted. The cattle baron was a man in his 50s, well-dressed and soft around the middle, in the way of someone who'd grown rich, telling other people to do hard work. His companions were cut from different cloth, lean, hard men, with the kind of eyes that suggested they'd seen violence and weren't particularly bothered by it. Mr. Boone, Crane said with the false heartiness of a politician. Beautiful morning, isn't it? What do you want, Crane? Straight to business. I like that. Crane's gaze shifted to Clara, lingering with an appreciation that made Elias's jaw clench. And you must be the famous Mrs. Sutton. The whole county's been talking about you. Mr. Crane. Clara's voice was cool and perfectly polite, giving away nothing of her discomfort. I've come with a proposition, Boone, a generous one. Crane gestured expansively at the surrounding land. This is a nice little spread you've got here, but it's small. Limited. A man with vision could do great things with this valley. My vision suits me fine. Does it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're struggling. Fences falling down, cattle scattered across 3 counties, buildings that haven't seen repair in years. Crane's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm prepared to offer you $20,000 for the whole operation, more than fair market value. The sum was staggering enough money to buy a much larger ranch in another territory, to start over somewhere fresh without the weight of old gossip and social complications. Clara felt Elias tense beside her, and she wondered if he was tempted by the possibility of escape. Not interested, Elias said flatly. Now don't be hasty. 20,000 is a lot of money, enough to set you and your housekeeper up quite comfortably somewhere else. The pause before housekeeper was deliberate, loaded with insinuation that made Clara's cheeks burn. Crane was making it clear that he knew exactly what kind of arrangement he thought she and Elias had, and that he considered it another piece of ammunition in his campaign to acquire the land. The lady's name is Mrs. Sutton, Elias said, his voice deadly quiet, and she deserves your respect. Of course, no offense intended. Crane's smile never wavered. But surely a respectable woman like Mrs. Sutton would appreciate the advantages that money could provide. Security, social standing, freedom from the kind of gossip that follows, unconventional living arrangements. Clara felt Elias's anger like heat radiating from a forge, and she placed a restraining hand on his arm. Mr. Crane, she said with icy politeness, Mr. Boone has made his position clear. Perhaps you should respect his decision. Ah, but has he considered all the factors? Crane's voice remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Running a ranch is dangerous work. Accidents happen. Fires start. Cattle get rustled. A man needs good neighbors to help him through hard times. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they were dealing with more than just unwanted offers. They were facing someone who wouldn't hesitate to use intimidation and possibly violence to get what he wanted. Are you threatening me, Crane? Elias stepped forward, his massive frame suddenly seeming less gentle giant and more protective warrior. Threatening, good heavens, no. Crane mounted his horse with practiced ease. I'm simply pointing out that the world can be an unpredictable place. 25,000, Boone. That's my final offer. Think about it. Think about what's best for the lady. As Crane and his men rode away, Clara and Elias stood in tense silence, both processing the implications of what had just occurred. The peaceful bubble of their newfound happiness had been punctured by the harsh reality of external forces that viewed their love and their land as obstacles to be overcome. "We need to be careful," Elias said finally. "We need to be strong," Clara corrected. "Together." She slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of two people who'd chosen to face whatever came as a united front. The photograph might be moved from the mantel, but the lesson Thomas had taught her about the importance of fighting for what mattered remained. "What if he's right about the gossip?" Elias asked. "What if staying here makes your life harder than it needs to be?" Clara turned to face him fully, her brown eyes blazing with determination. "Elias Boone, if you think I'm going to let Jeremiah Crane or anyone else chase me away from the best thing that's ever happened to me, you don't know me very well." "And what's the best thing that's ever happened to you?" "You," she said simply. "This. Us. Whatever we're building here together." The smile that spread across Elias's face was worth every whispered judgment, every veiled threat, every social convention they'd have to navigate. He pulled her into his arms right there on the porch, kissing her with the fierce joy of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. As they held each other in the morning sunshine, both understood that their real test was just beginning. But they also knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, and sometimes, when you found love worth having, that was enough. Clara was searching for extra blankets in the old trunk beneath Elias's bedroom window when her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a leather portfolio wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden beneath layers of winter clothes and forgotten memories. The discovery was accidental, the result of an autumn chill that had prompted her to prepare the house for colder weather. But as she unwrapped the package with careful hands, Clara realized she'd stumbled upon something that might change everything. The land deed inside was yellowed with age, its formal language dense with legal terminology that was difficult to pass. But certain phrases jumped out at her as she read by lamplight. Mineral rights in perpetuity, subterranean deposits of coal, silver, and other valuable substances, extending to depths of 500 feet below the surface. Her heart began to race as the implications became clear. This wasn't just the deed to Elias's ranch, it was a document that granted ownership of whatever lay beneath the soil, a provision that could make the difference between modest comfort and genuine wealth. "Elias," she called, her voice tight with excitement and confusion. "Could you come here, please?" He appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from the afternoon nap she'd insisted he take after 3 days of brutal work preparing for winter. The sight of him, rumpled and relaxed in a way he'd never been before, their relationship deepened, made her heart perform its familiar acrobatics even in the midst of her discovery. "What is it?" he asked, noting the papers in her hands and the intensity of her expression. "I found something. In your trunk I was looking for blankets, and there was this portfolio." Clara held up the deed with trembling fingers. "Elias, did you know about the mineral rights?" His brow furrowed as he moved closer, taking the document from her hands to examine it with the careful attention of someone trying to decipher a foreign language. "I remember my father mentioning something about what was under the ground, but I never paid much attention. Always figured it was just wishful thinking." "This isn't wishful thinking," Clara said, pointing to the relevant clauses. "This is a legal document that says you own everything beneath this land down to 500 feet. Coal, silver, anything that might be down there." Elias sank into his chair, the weight of realization settling over his features. "Do you think is there actually something valuable under this land?" Clara thought about Jeremiah Crane's persistent offers, his willingness to pay far above market value for what appeared to be a modest ranch operation. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. "I think," she said slowly, that might explain why Mr. Crane is so interested in buying your property. They spent the evening poring over the documents, finding additional papers that detailed survey work done on the land years before Elias's father had purchased it. The reports were technical and difficult to understand, but the conclusions were clear enough. Substantial coal deposits lay beneath the valley, along with veins of silver that could prove extremely profitable with proper mining equipment. "My father never said anything about this," Elias said, his voice heavy with bewilderment. "Why would he keep it secret?" Clara studied the dates on the documents, noting that the surveys had been completed just months before Elias's father disappeared. "Maybe he planned to tell you when you were older. Maybe he was afraid of what might happen if word got out about what was under the ground. You think he knew about Crane? I think your father was a smart man who understood that some kinds of wealth attract the wrong kind of attention." Clara touched Elias's hand gently. "The question is, what do we do now?" The "we" came naturally, another sign of how completely their lives had become intertwined. But as soon as the word left her lips, Clara felt a flicker of uncertainty. These weren't her documents, her land, her decisions to make. She was still, technically, just Elias's employee, despite the love that had grown between them. "We?" Elias asked, his eyes searching her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to presume." "No." He caught her hand, squeezing gently. "I like the sound of we. I want your opinion, Clara. I need it." The simple admission sent warmth cascading through Clara's chest. After months of feeling powerless, of having decisions made for her by circumstances beyond her control, being asked for her thoughts on something so important felt like a gift. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to be very careful about who we trust with this information, and I think we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before anyone else finds out." "How do we do that?" Clara thought of the people they knew in Red Bluff, trying to identify someone with the knowledge and discretion to help them navigate this complicated situation. Dr. Morrison went to college back east. He might know about mining law, or at least know someone who does. Can we trust him? He delivered Thomas when his time came, sat with me through the worst nights when hope was all we had left. Clara's voice grew soft with memory. He's a good man, Elias. Discreet and honest. They decided to approach Dr. Morrison the next day, but as Clara lay in her narrow bed that night, her mind raced with possibilities and fears. If the documents were accurate, Elias was potentially sitting on a fortune enough money to change everything about their circumstances, to buy respectability and security, and freedom from the kind of gossip that had plagued them since the beginning. But she also understood that wealth brought its own complications. Jeremiah Crane wouldn't give up easily if he knew what lay beneath Elias's land, and there might be others with similar interests and fewer scruples about how they pursued their goals. More troubling was the question of what this discovery might mean for their relationship. Money changed people, changed the dynamics between them. Would Elias still want or need her if he became a man of substantial means? Would their love survive the transformation from struggling ranch owner and widowed housekeeper to wealthy landowner and what? What would her place be in his new world? In the main room, Elias stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table and tried to process the magnitude of what Clara had discovered. His father's land might be worth more than he'd ever imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd abandoned his family had also left behind the means to transform their son's life completely. But beneath the excitement of potential wealth lay deeper concerns. Elias had spent his entire adult life proving that he could succeed through honest work and determination. The idea of sudden, unearned riches felt somehow undeserved, as if he'd be taking advantage of circumstances rather than earning his way through effort and character. And then there was Clara, beautiful, brave Clara, who'd chosen to love him when he was nothing more than a lonely rancher with a fearsome reputation. How could he know if her feelings were genuine, if his circumstances changed so dramatically? How could either of them be sure that what they had together could survive the test of significant wealth? The questions plagued him through the long night, but when morning came and Clara appeared in the kitchen with her usual gentle smile, Elias felt his doubts settle into manageable concern. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. The woman who'd defended him against social pressure and threatened cattle barons wasn't likely to be corrupted by money or intimidated by change. "Ready?" Clara asked as they prepared to ride into town. "Ready," Elias replied, tucking the precious documents into his jacket pocket. But as they climbed into the wagon, both understood that they were embarking on more than just a trip to seek professional advice. They were taking the first step into a future that might bear no resemblance to the quiet life they'd been building together. A future that would test everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the true nature of happiness. The documents that had been hidden for so many years would either provide the key to a better life or prove that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are the ones we never intended to make. Only time would tell which version of their story would prove true. Elias's mother's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its pages yellow with age and soft with handling. Clara had found it while searching for additional family documents that might support their legal case, and now she traced her finger along the careful script that recorded 3 generations of births, deaths, and marriages in the Boone family line. "Look at this," she said, her voice tight with excitement as Elias leaned over her shoulder to see what she'd discovered. "Your grandfather's name was Josiah Boone, and according to this, he owned land in 3 counties before your father was born." The family record painted a picture far different from the story Elias had always believed about his heritage. Instead of drifters and wanderers, the Boones appeared to have been substantial landowners, with holdings that stretched across much of the territory. More importantly, the careful notations included references to mining claims and water rights that could prove crucial in their legal battle against Jeremiah Crane. "I never knew," Elias said, his voice heavy with wonder and regret. "My father always made it sound like we came from nothing, like this ranch was the first real thing our family had ever owned." "Maybe he was trying to protect you," Clara suggested gently. "If he knew that Crane or men like him were interested in acquiring land with mineral rights, he might have thought it was safer for you to believe you were just a simple rancher." Dr. Morrison had confirmed their suspicions about the value of the documents Clara had found. The mineral rights were legitimate and potentially very valuable, but enforcing them would require a legal battle that could drag on for months or even years. Worse, Crane had apparently been filing claims of his own, using legal technicalities and bureaucratic manipulation to challenge the validity of Elias's ownership. "The good news," Dr. Morrison had explained during their clandestine meeting in his office, "is that your family's ownership predates any claims Crane might make. The bad news is that possession is 9/10 of the law, and he's already begun moving equipment onto the land adjacent to yours." The implications were clear. Crane wasn't planning to wait for legal resolution. He intended to begin mining operations, whether Elias agreed to sell or not, gambling that he could present the courts with a fait accompli that would be difficult to reverse. "We need help," Clara said now, closing the Bible with careful reverence. "Real help from people who understand how to fight men like Crane." "Who's going to stand up to the richest man in 3 counties?" Elias asked. But there was determination in his voice, rather than defeat. The discovery of his family's true history had awakened something in him, a sense of legacy and responsibility that went beyond his own immediate concerns. "More people than you might think," Clara replied. "Crane hasn't made himself popular with his high-handed tactics. There are other ranchers, other families who felt pressure to sell. Maybe it's time they understood what they're really fighting for." They spent the next 3 days riding across the valley, visiting neighbors who'd always kept their distance from the intimidating giant and his unconventional housekeeper. But the evidence Clara and Elias carried, documents proving that Crane's interest in the land went far beyond cattle ranching, changed everything. Tom Bradley, whose small spread bordered Elias's to the north, studied the mineral survey reports with the intense focus of a man who'd spent 40 years reading the land for signs of water, grass, and soil quality. "I knew something wasn't right," he said finally. "Crane offered me 3 times what my land was worth, said he needed it for expanded grazing. But you don't pay premium prices for grass, especially not marginal grass like mine. Sarah McKinney, the widow who ran her late husband's ranch with the help of her 2 teenage sons, was even more direct in her response. "That snake's been circling my property for 2 years," she said, her weathered hands gripping the survey documents with white-knuckled intensity. "Made all kinds of promises about how much easier my life would be if I just sold out and moved to town. Now I understand why he was so persistent." By the end of their circuit through the valley, Clara and Elias had assembled an unlikely alliance. 6 families who'd felt Crane's pressure to sell, along with Dr. Morrison and Reverend Fletcher, who'd grown concerned about the cattle baron's influence over local politics. "We need to present a united front," Dr. Morrison explained, during their meeting in the church basement, chosen for its privacy and symbolic significance. "Crane's been picking us off one by one, using his money and influence to isolate potential opponents. But if we stand together, pool our resources and our evidence, we might have a chance." The plan they developed was risky but comprehensive. While Dr. Morrison contacted lawyers in the territorial capital who might be willing to take on Crane's legal team, the others would document every instance of intimidation, every questionable land deal, every example of the cattle baron's strong-arm tactics. "He's gotten away with this because people were afraid to speak up," Reverend Fletcher said, his normally gentle voice hardened by righteous anger. "But fear only works when people feel alone. Together, we have power." Clara felt a surge of hope as she looked around the basement at the faces of people who'd chosen courage over comfort, principle over pragmatism. These weren't wealthy or influential people. They were farmers and ranchers and working folks who decided that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. But as they finalized their plans, a commotion outside the church made everyone freeze. Through the small basement windows, they could see the glow of fire in the distance, orange light flickering against the dark sky in the direction of Elias's ranch. "No," Elias breathed, understanding immediately what they were seeing. They rode hard through the night, arriving at the ranch to find the barn engulfed in flames and Crane's men nowhere to be seen. The volunteer fire brigade from town was already working to contain the blaze, but it was clear that the building and everything in it would be a total loss. "I'm sorry, Elias," Sheriff Morton said, his face grim in the firelight. "By the time we got word and made it out here, it was too far gone to save." "How did it start?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Hard to say. Could have been a lantern knocked over, could have been lightning, could have been anything." But the meaningful look Morton gave them suggested he understood exactly what had happened, even if he couldn't prove it in court. Crane had sent a message: cooperate or face escalating consequences. As they stood watching the flames consume months of hard work and preparation for winter, Clara felt Elias's hand find hers in the darkness. His fingers were steady, despite the magnitude of their loss, and when she looked up at his face, she saw not defeat, but resolution. "This changes nothing," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "If anything, it proves we're right to fight." "It proves he's dangerous," Clara replied, fear for their safety mixing with anger at the injustice of it all. "Then we'll be more careful, but we won't back down." The next morning brought news that made their situation even more precarious. Mrs. Henderson appeared at their door with the satisfaction of someone delivering long-awaited vindication. "Clara May, I've come to offer you sanctuary," she announced, her voice dripping with false concern. "After last night's incident, surely you can see that this situation has become untenable." "I appreciate your concern," Clara replied with careful politeness, "but Mr. Boone and I are managing just fine." "Are you? Because it looks to me like someone's trying to send you a message, and the next message might not be limited to buildings." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson knew more about the barn fire than she was letting on, and her sudden concern for Clara's welfare suggested that word of their legal challenge had already reached Crane's ears. "Thank you for the warning," Clara said, her voice steady despite the chill running down her spine. "But I've made my choice." After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara and Elias spent the morning salvaging what they could from the burned barn and preparing for what seemed like inevitable escalation. The coalition they'd formed the night before felt fragile in the harsh light of day, especially with concrete evidence of what Crane was willing to do to protect his interests. "Maybe we should reconsider his offer," Elias said as they surveyed the charred remains of his livelihood. $25,000 would be enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere safe. Clara stopped her work and turned to face him, seeing the doubt and fear he was trying to hide beneath practical concerns. "Is that what you want? To run away?" "I want you to be safe. I want us to have a future that doesn't involve looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives. And I want us to have a future we can be proud of," Clara replied firmly. "Elias, if we give in now, Crane wins everything. Not just your land, but the precedent that fear and intimidation work. How many other families will suffer because we were too afraid to stand up?" Before Elias could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. But instead of Crane or his men, they saw Tom Bradley and Sarah McKinney riding toward them, followed by Dr. Morrison and two men Clara didn't recognize. "Heard about the fire," Bradley said as he dismounted. "Came to see what we could do to help, and to introduce you to some friends." Dr. Morrison added, gesturing to the strangers, "This is James Parker, attorney from the territorial capital, and Samuel Cross, a mining engineer who specializes in property disputes." Parker was a thin, intense man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested he'd made a career of seeing through deception. Cross was older, weathered by years of outdoor work, with the practical demeanor of someone who dealt in facts rather than theories. "Dr. Morrison has filled us in on your situation," Parker said without preamble, "and after reviewing the documents you've provided, I'm prepared to take your case." "What about Crane's legal team?" Elias asked. "We can't afford to match his resources." "You don't need to match them," Cross interjected. "You just need to be right. And from what I've seen of your mineral surveys and property deeds, you're definitely right." Parker spread a map across the remains of Elias's workbench, pointing to areas marked with Cross's notations. "The mineral deposits extend far beyond your property lines, which means Crane's interest isn't limited to your ranch. He's been systematically acquiring land throughout the valley, probably planning to consolidate everything into one massive mining operation, which is illegal without proper environmental surveys and territorial approval," Cross added. "Mining operations of that scale require permits he doesn't have and couldn't get without notifying every landowner in the affected area. So he's been trying to buy the land quietly, hoping to present the territorial government with a fait accompli," Parker concluded. "But your family's historical claims and the evidence of intimidation we're documenting could stop him cold." Clara felt hope begin to bloom in her chest as she listened to the legal strategy taking shape. These weren't just empty promises or wishful thinking. Parker and Cross had concrete plans for challenging Crane's schemes through legitimate channels. "There's something else," Sarah McKinney said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Yesterday, before the fire, 2 of Crane's men came to my ranch, offered to buy me out for $30,000, but said the offer would only be good for 24 hours. "They gave you a deadline?" Parker asked, his interest sharpening. "Said if I didn't sign by today, the offer would be withdrawn permanently, and they made it clear that anyone who stood with Elias would be considered an enemy of progress." Cross whistled low. "That's not just intimidation, that's conspiracy to defraud. If we can prove he's been making similar offers to other landowners." "We can," Dr. Morrison said grimly. "Half the valley has been pressured to sell in the last week. Crane's getting desperate." As the group made plans for the legal battle ahead, Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The Bible that had revealed Elias's family history lay nearby, its pages containing not just genealogical records, but moral imperatives about standing up for justice and protecting the innocent. "There's going to be a court hearing next week," Parker explained. "Crane's lawyers have filed for an emergency injunction, claiming that ongoing mining operations are essential for territorial development. We'll have one chance to present our evidence and convince the judge that his claims are fraudulent. What happens if we lose? Elias asked. Then Crane gets everything he wants, and families like yours get displaced for the sake of his profits. Parker replied bluntly, but if we win, we set a precedent that protects property rights throughout the territory. That evening, as Clara and Elias sat in their damaged kitchen planning for the fight ahead, she reached for his mother's Bible and turned to a passage that had caught her attention earlier. Be strong and courageous, she read aloud. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Elias looked at her with something approaching awe. You really believe that, don't you? That we're doing the right thing? I believe that some things are worth fighting for, Clara replied. And I believe that real love means standing together when everything else falls apart. Even if it costs us everything. Clara reached across the table to take his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his honest work, his determination to build something good from nothing. Elias, I'd rather lose everything fighting alongside you than win everything by abandoning what we believe in. As they prepared for what might be the most important week of their lives, both understood that they were fighting for more than just land or mineral rights. They were fighting for the right to love freely, to build a life based on mutual respect and shared values, to prove that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary pressure when they had something precious to protect. The battle ahead would test everything they thought they knew about justice, courage, and the power of truth to triumph over corruption. But whatever the outcome, they would face it together, and sometimes that was the only victory that truly mattered. The courthouse gavel lay silent on Judge Harrison's bench as the packed courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Clara had never seen so many people crammed into Red Bluff's small legal chamber ranchers and townspeople, lawyers and witnesses, all drawn by word that the hearing would determine the future of the entire valley. She sat in the front row beside Elias, acutely aware of the hostile stares from Crane's supporters and the whispered speculation about her presence at what many considered a man's business. But James Parker had insisted she attend, explaining that her discovery of the crucial documents made her testimony essential to their case. Remember, Parker had coached them that morning, stick to the facts, don't let Crane's lawyers provoke you into emotional responses. We have the law on our side, but only if we present our evidence clearly and professionally. Jeremiah Crane sat across the aisle with his team of 3 lawyers, his expensive suit and confident demeanor projecting the image of a successful businessman defending legitimate interests. But Clara noticed the way his eyes kept darting to the documents spread on Parker's table, and she took satisfaction in the slight tension around his mouth that suggested he wasn't as certain of victory as he appeared. Judge Harrison called the session to order with a sharp rap of his gavel, the sound echoing through the crowded room like a gunshot. This hearing will determine the validity of competing claims to mineral rights in the Red Bluff Valley. Mr. Crane's petition for emergency mining privileges versus Mr. Boone's assertion of historical ownership. Mr. Davidson, you may present the petitioner's case. Crane's lead attorney was a polished man from Denver with silver hair and a voice trained to project authority. He painted a picture of territorial progress and economic development that would benefit everyone in the valley, describing Crane's mining operation as essential infrastructure that couldn't be delayed by frivolous legal challenges. Your Honor, Davidson argued, my client represents modern efficiency and scientific progress. Mr. Boone's claims are based on dusty paperwork that predates proper territorial surveying. The greater good demands that we move forward with operations that will bring jobs and prosperity to this entire region. Clara felt her stomach clench as Davidson systematically dismissed their evidence, making their carefully researched case sound like the desperate grabbing of a failing rancher. When he began questioning Elias's mental competence, suggesting that a man of his limited education and social isolation couldn't properly understand complex legal documents, she had to grip the bench to keep from standing up in protest. Furthermore, Davidson continued, The current arrangement on Mr. Boone's property raises serious questions about moral fitness and decision-making capacity. A man who allows an unmarried woman to live in his home without proper supervision clearly lacks the judgment necessary to manage valuable mineral resources. The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow, reducing her relationship with Elias to something sordid and shameful. She felt heat rise in her cheeks as the courtroom buzzed with renewed whispers, saw the satisfied smirks on the faces of the women who'd tried to shame her away from the ranch. But when she looked at Elias, she saw something that gave her strength. His jaw was clenched with suppressed anger, but his eyes held steady determination rather than shame. He reached for her hand openly, right there in the courtroom, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that declared their relationship something to be proud of rather than hidden. "Your Honor," Parker rose with calm dignity, "I object to counsel's characterization of my client's personal life, which has no bearing on the legal question before this court." "Sustained," Judge Harrison ruled. "Mr. Davidson, please confine your arguments to matters of law and property rights." Parker's presentation was methodical and devastating. He walked the court through 3 generations of Boone family ownership, demonstrating how Elias's mineral rights predated territorial government and couldn't be superseded by administrative convenience. "Mrs. Sutton," Parker called, and Clara felt her heart race as she approached the witness stand. "Please tell the court how you discovered the documents in question." Clara's voice was steady as she described, finding the hidden portfolio, her careful examination of the papers, and her realization of their significance. She'd rehearsed this testimony for days, but standing before the packed courtroom, felt surreal, a farmwoman's daughter from modest origins, holding the attention of judges and lawyers with her words. "And what was your assessment of these documents' authenticity?" Parker asked. "They matched the other family records perfectly," Clara replied. "The handwriting, the paper, the legal language, everything was consistent with documents from that time period." Davidson's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to paint Clara as an opportunistic woman who'd manipulated a simple rancher for personal gain, but his attack only served to highlight her intelligence and integrity. "Mrs. Sutton, isn't it true that you stand to benefit significantly if Mr. Boone's claims are upheld?" "I stand to benefit from seeing justice done," Clara replied firmly. "Mr. Boone's success or failure doesn't change my circumstances. I have my own skills and my own ability to support myself. Yet you live in his home, eat his food, depend on his employment." "I work for my wages, sir. I cook his meals, maintain his household, and earn every penny of my pay through honest labor." "If you're suggesting there's something improper about that arrangement, perhaps you should examine your own assumptions about women's capabilities." The response drew murmurs of approval from several women in the courtroom, and Clara saw Judge Harrison's mouth twitch with what might have been suppressed amusement. When Samuel Cross took the stand, his testimony provided the technical foundation for their case. The mining engineer's assessment of the mineral surveys was unambiguous. The deposits in question lay primarily beneath Elias's property, making his ownership rights crucial to any legitimate mining operation. "In your professional opinion," Parker asked, "could large-scale mining proceed in this valley without access to Mr. Boone's land?" "Absolutely not," Cross replied. "The geological formation is continuous. Any attempt to mine around his property would be economically unfeasible and environmentally disastrous." Davidson tried to challenge Cross's credentials and methodology, but the engineer's reputation was impeccable and his conclusions supported by decades of experience. As the morning session concluded, Clara felt cautiously optimistic. Their evidence was strong, their witnesses credible, and Parker had presented their case with skill and professionalism. But she also knew that Crane hadn't survived in business by accepting defeat gracefully, and the afternoon session would likely bring new challenges. Elias's father's compass sat heavy in his jacket pocket as he approached the witness stand for what would likely be the most important testimony of his life. The brass instrument had belonged to 3 generations of Boone men, passed down as a symbol of finding true direction even in unfamiliar territory. Today, It would serve as a reminder that some paths were worth following regardless of how difficult the journey became. The afternoon session had begun with a surprise revelation that changed the entire dynamic of the case. Sheriff Morton, looking uncomfortable but determined, had taken the stand to present evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond simple property disputes. "Your Honor," Parker had announced, "new evidence has come to light that demonstrates a pattern of criminal intimidation and fraud designed to coerce property sales throughout the valley." Morton's testimony was devastating. Working with federal marshals who'd been quietly investigating Crane's operations, he documented a systematic campaign of threats, property damage, and legal manipulation that violated both territorial and federal laws. "We found records of similar operations in 3 other territories," Morton explained. Mr. Crane would identify areas with valuable mineral deposits, then use intimidation and fraud to acquire the land at below-market prices before revealing the true value of the resources. The evidence included detailed accounts of the barn fire, witness statements about threats made to other landowners, and financial records showing how Crane had used shell companies to hide his true intentions from territorial authorities. But it was Elias's own testimony that provided the emotional heart of their case. As he stood before the packed courtroom, his massive frame somehow conveying both strength and vulnerability, Clara felt her heart swell with pride for the man who'd found his voice when it mattered most. "Mr. Boone," Parker began gently, "please tell the court about your family's history with this land." Elias's voice was quiet but clear as he described growing up on the ranch, his father's sudden disappearance, and the years of hard work that had built his operation from nothing. His testimony was simple and honest, free of legal jargon but powerful in its authenticity. "This land isn't just property to me," Elias said, his gaze finding Clara's face in the crowd. "It's where I learned what it means to work hard and build something with your own hands. It's where I found the courage to hope for more than just survival. It's where I learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his size or his reputation, but by his willingness to stand up for what's right." Davidson's cross-examination was brutal, designed to portray Elias as a simple-minded giant who couldn't possibly understand the complex legal and economic issues at stake. "Mr. Boone, you have no formal education beyond grade school, is that correct?" "That's correct. No training in law, geology, or business." "No, sir. Yet you claim to understand documents that even trained professionals find complex." Elias was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him drawing on reserves of inner strength she'd watched him develop over months of learning to trust in his own worth. "I understand that this land has been in my family for 3 generations, he said finally. "I understand that my father died believing he was leaving me something valuable, and I understand that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. But surely a man of your limitations would be better served by accepting a generous offer and leaving complex business matters to those more qualified to handle them." The condescension in Davidson's voice was unmistakable, and Clara saw something shift in Elias's expression. The careful mask of respectful submission fell away, replaced by the quiet dignity of a man who'd finally learned his own worth. "Mr. Davidson," Elias said, his voice carrying new authority, "I may not have your education or your fancy words, but I know the difference between right and wrong, and I know that backing down from bullies, no matter how rich or powerful they are, only encourages them to find new victims. You consider my client a bully. I consider anyone who burns down a man's barn to force him to sell his land a bully, yes, sir." The admission created an uproar in the courtroom. Davidson objected vigorously, claiming there was no evidence linking his client to the fire, but the damage was done. Elias had stated plainly what everyone suspected, and his simple honesty carried more weight than any legal argument. When Judge Harrison called for closing arguments, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Davidson made a final plea for economic progress and efficient resource management, but his polished rhetoric felt hollow after the emotional authenticity of the testimonies they'd heard. Parker's closing was passionate but measured, weaving together the legal evidence with the human story of families fighting to protect their heritage from corporate greed. "Your Honor," Parker concluded, "this case isn't really about mineral rights or mining permits. It's about whether the law protects honest citizens or serves the interests of those wealthy enough to buy influence. Mr. Boone and the other families in this valley aren't asking for special treatment, they're asking for justice. They're asking that their legal rights be respected and their property protected from criminal intimidation." Judge Harrison announced that he would render his decision immediately, sending a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Most had expected days or weeks of deliberation for such a complex case. After reviewing the evidence presented today, Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This court finds that Mr. Boone's mineral rights are valid and predate any claims made by the petitioner." Clara felt her heart leap with joy, but Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the evidence of criminal conspiracy and intimidation presented by the Territorial Marshal's office demands immediate action. Mr. Crane, you are hereby ordered to cease all mining operations in the Red Bluff Valley, pending a full federal investigation of your business practices." The courtroom erupted in celebration and protests as the full implications of the ruling became clear. Crane's face had gone ashen, while his lawyers huddled in urgent conference about appeals and emergency injunctions. But Clara only had eyes for Elias, who was making his way through the crowd toward her with a smile that transformed his entire face. When he reached her, he swept her into his arms right there in the courtroom, spinning her around as if she weighed nothing at all. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We actually did it." "You did it," Clara replied, framing his face with her hands. "You found your voice, Elias Boone. You stood up and told the truth, and the truth was enough." As they held each other in the midst of celebration and chaos, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death-complete security in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. They'd faced the worst that fear and greed could throw at them, and they'd emerged stronger than before. The compass in Elias's pocket had served its purpose, guiding them through treacherous territory to a destination worth reaching. Now, as they looked toward a future free from the shadows of Crane's threats, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together, and sometimes that was the only compass anyone really needed. The new wedding rings lay simple and perfect in Clara's palm, their golden surfaces catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the kitchen window. Sam Thompson, the local blacksmith, had crafted them from gold that Elias himself had panned from the creek running through their property, fitting symbol of love built from the land they'd fought so hard to protect. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory that changed everything. Jeremiah Crane had fled the territory under federal indictment, his vast holdings broken up and sold to the families he'd tried to intimidate. The mining rights that had seemed like such a burden now provided steady income that allowed Elias and Clara to improve the ranch without compromising their simple way of life. But more important than the financial security was the transformation in how the community saw them. The couple who'd once been subjects of gossip and speculation were now respected as the people who'd stood up to corruption and won. Their upcoming wedding had become a celebration that the entire valley wanted to share. "Are you nervous?" Sarah McKinney asked, as she helped Clara into her wedding dress, a simple blue silk that complemented her eyes and flattered her figure without pretension or excess. "Terrified," Clara admitted with a laugh. "Not about marrying Elias, but about standing up in front of half the county and pretending to be the kind of woman who deserves this much happiness." "Clara May Sutton," Sarah said firmly, "you're exactly the kind of woman who deserves happiness. You fought for it, earned it, and proved you're strong enough to keep it." The dress had belonged to Sarah's daughter, altered to fit Clara with loving care by the women who'd once whispered about her reputation. Mrs. Patterson had contributed her mother's pearl necklace, while Mrs. Cole had offered her grandmother's lace handkerchief. Even Mrs. Henderson, swallowing considerable pride, had presented Clara with a bouquet of wildflowers from her own garden. The gesture represented more than simple wedding gifts. They were offerings of acceptance, acknowledgements that Clara and Elias belonged in this community as much as anyone born to it. Outside, the ranch buzzed with preparation for the ceremony that would take place in the meadow behind the house. Tom Bradley and his sons had built a simple altar from lumber milled on their own land, while Dr. Morrison supervised the arrangement of chairs borrowed from the church and schoolhouse. Reverend Fletcher had initially hesitated to perform the ceremony, concerned about the propriety of blessing a union that had begun under such unconventional circumstances. But Clara's quiet dignity and Elias's obvious devotion had won him over, and now he spoke of their love as proof that God worked in mysterious ways to bring healing to broken hearts. In the barn rebuilt, bigger and better than before, Elias stood before a mirror borrowed from the McKinney Ranch, trying to knot his tie with hands that seemed too large for such delicate work. Tom Bradley and Dr. Morrison watched with amused sympathy as the normally steady-handed rancher fumbled with the silk. "Let me," Dr. Morrison said, stepping forward to help. "You'd think a man who can rope a steer could manage a simple necktie." "Steers don't move when you're trying to catch them," Elias replied, but his voice carried none of its old self-deprecating tone. The man who'd learned to value himself was nervous about his wedding day, but not ashamed of his limitations. "Any second thoughts?" Bradley asked, as they made final adjustments to Elias's best suit. "Only that I waited so long to ask her," Elias replied. "Every day with Clara feels like a gift I don't deserve but can't imagine living without." The proposal had come on a quiet evening 3 months after the trial, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. Elias had been unusually quiet all day, and Clara had assumed he was wrestling with some ranch problem or legal complication. Instead, he dropped to one knee right there on the weathered boards, pulling out a ring he'd commissioned from their own gold and asking if she'd do him the honor of becoming his wife in more than just the eyes of gossips and judges. Clara's yes had been immediate and emphatic, followed by tears of joy and kisses that tasted like hope fulfilled and promises kept. Now, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the moment they'd been planning and dreaming about was finally at hand. The guests, nearly 100 people from across the valley, had taken their seats in the meadow, their voices creating a warm buzz of anticipation and goodwill. Clara took one last look in the mirror, seeing not the plain widow the townspeople had once pitied, but a woman transformed by love and purpose. The face looking back at her glowed with contentment and confidence, proof that happiness could indeed bloom in the most unexpected soil. "Ready?" Sarah asked, offering her arm for the walk to the altar. "Ready," Clara replied, and meant it completely. The ceremony itself was simple and perfect, conducted under a sky so blue it seemed like a benediction. Elias waited at the altar in his best suit, his massive frame somehow both imposing and gentle, his eyes fixed on Clara as if she were the only person in the world. Reverend Fletcher's words about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage carried special weight for a couple who'd faced real tests of their devotion. When it came time for vows, both Clara and Elias had chosen to speak from their hearts rather than recite traditional promises. "Clara," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "you came into my life when I'd given up hoping for anything beyond survival. You saw something good in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You stood beside me when the whole world seemed against us. I promise to love you with everything I have, to protect you with everything I am, and to build a life with you that honors the gift of your faith in me." Clara's response was equally heartfelt, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Elias, you taught me that love doesn't end with death. It makes room for new chapters, new possibilities, new kinds of happiness. You showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right, despite being afraid. I promise to stand with you through whatever comes, to build something beautiful with you on this land we've fought to protect, and to love you with all the strength of a heart that's been broken and healed and made stronger in the healing." When Reverend Fletcher pronounced them husband and wife, The cheer that went up from the gathered crowd could probably be heard in the next county. But Clara and Elias only had awareness for each other, for the kiss that sealed their promise and the moment when they officially became family in the eyes of God and their community. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice as many people. Clara found herself passed from hand to hand by well-wishers who wanted to share stories about how her courage had inspired them, how her love for Elias had changed their own understanding of what made a proper match. But the moment that meant the most came as the evening wound down, when she and Elias finally found themselves alone on their porch, watching the last guests make their way home under a canopy of stars. "Mrs. Boone," Elias said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure. "I like the sound of that," Clara replied, settling into the circle of his arms with the contentment of someone who'd finally found her permanent place in the world. "Any regrets?" "Only that we wasted so much time being careful when we could have been happy." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the loneliness that had driven them together, the challenges that had tested them, the love that had sustained them through everything. The empty coffee cup that had symbolized Elias's solitude now sat in their kitchen beside its mate, proof that no one had to face life's difficulties alone. The ranch around them hummed with quiet contentment, their land secure and their future bright with possibility. They'd learned that love wasn't always convenient or socially acceptable, but it was always worth fighting for when it was real. And sometimes, when you were brave enough to trust in love's power to heal and transform, you discovered that the most beautiful stories were the ones that began with two broken people deciding to build something whole together.